Now let's take a more detailed look at the dialog boxes that have been popping up as we've been designing things. We'll take a look at the dialog boxes for sketch-based features and for dress-up features, and we'll understand what we mean by everything and half of everything. Okay, and then after that, we'll take a look at some of the items within these dialog boxes, the limits that are up to next, up to last, mirrors, and things like that. Okay. Here we have a pretty typical little part, and it's made up of several features in its specification tree. Now, some of these features, like the pads and this pocket down here, those are sketch-based features. And others, like the edge fillets here and the chamfer here, these are dress-up features. And each of these have a dialog box. So let's take a look at this pad first. Let's unhide its sketch. This sketch here was used to make this, this initial first pad. Let's double-click the sketch, and we see that the length and width of the sketch are specified here in the sketch. Okay. However, if I double-click the pad, which pulls up the pad dialog box, the dialog box actually contains the height of that feature. So the length and width are contained in the sketch. The dialog box only contains the height. Now, it contains a lot of other things too, but the dimensions for this feature are split between the dialog box and its supporting sketch. Now, the same is true for this pocket. If I double-click the pocket, let's unhide its sketch, and let's go into its sketch, and I see that the dimension for this width here is contained in the sketch, and the length is contained by some concentricities which we've applied to this sketch. So part of the dimensions of that pocket are contained in the sketch. The actual length of the pocket, how far down it goes, is contained in its dialog box. Its dialog box says it's going to go all the way through. If we change it to be a dimension, we can actually make it just go partially through. Okay, and let's hit update. Okay. So here we see that the dialog boxes for sketch-based features only contain part of the information. If I double-click this chamfer, though, there is no supporting sketch, so everything about this chamfer has to be defined here in this dialog box. So that's what we mean here by sketch-based features contain about, the dialog boxes contain about half of everything, and for dress-up features, since there is no supporting sketch, everything about them must be defined by the dialog box. Now let's point out some similarities between some of the dialog boxes. I'll hide this sketch here to get it out of the way, and I'll hide this sketch to get it out of the way. And let's take a look at the similarities between the dialog box for the pad and the dialog box for the pocket. We'll double-click the pad, select More, and we'll see that it has in its dialog box the ability to set the height here as 20, and I can actually physically drag it down and up, and you could see the height changing. Okay. It can also go in the other direction, and you can watch the values in the other direction change there. So it has a first limit and a second limit, and there's some other options here called thick and mirrored extent and things like that. Let's hit OK, and we'll hit update. And you'll notice our part has changed a little bit. Now let's take a look at the dialog box for the pocket. Okay, and again, it has a lot of the same things. It has a first limit and a second limit. So I can actually drag this a little deeper, and you see my first limit changing. And my second limit, I could change it by dragging it down. And now, if we say OK, wow, that actually is a pocket inside of my part. I can't even really see it. So let's double-click it and get it back to where we can see it by changing the second limit either up to the surface there or bringing it up high in space, and we'll say preview. Oh, good. There we go. Okay, and update. But the Pocket dialog box has a lot of the same options here, the thick options, and we'll learn what these are later, but I'm pointing out here that they're very similar dialog boxes. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn what the first limit, what all these are, and we're going to learn the second limit and what all these are. We're going to learn those for the pad, but then as soon as we learn for the pad, they really are the same for the Pocket. So learning a pad will take quite a bit of time, but learning a Pocket and some of the other sketch-based features will be much, much quicker. Now let's take a little bit more in-depth look at the dialog boxes and what some of the options are for them. Some of these options like up to next, and we'll learn some of the others like up to last. Okay, let's take a look. Here's our starter model, and I drew a few sketches on a couple of different planes and colored them so that they'd be easy for you to identify. I put them on different planes simply because I didn't want you to think that they were the same sketch. And these are we're gonna have these sketches add features to this part. So I'm going to take a pad and I'm going to select the green sketch, and I'll select more here to see the entire dialog box. And I can drag this limit 1, and notice it's changing here. I can drag limit 2, and I can key it in also. And if I do preview, this is a preview of the solid, or if you go to the tree, this is a feature-based, a sketch-based feature, and it would be created right there. Now, for limit 1, I can say up to next, and it will go up to the next surface that it finds in the current part body. Okay, so it found this one. If I say up to last, it will go all the way through to the very last surface it finds. Of course, once it gets into the interior here, you really can't see it, but it is going all the way up to the very last surface there. Okay. Now, you'll notice that limit 2 is positive in this direction, which is the opposite direction of the arrow. If I drag it up here, as soon as it goes onto the limit 1 side, it becomes negative. Okay? Now, what would happen if we did the second limit as up to last? Well, there is nothing in the other direction. It would go to infinity. So it's telling me there's an error there. Okay, so we can't use up to last in the second direction. We must use a dimension. Okay, so let's use a dimension and let's put it here. Okay, we can't use up to next because there is no next in the limit 2 direction, so we must use a dimension or something like an up to plane. In up to plane, now it's wanting me to select a plane, and in fact you can read down here, it says select the second limit, and I can select, say, this plane. So now limit 2 is going from here, and limit 1 is going from here. Okay, let's do a preview. Ah, that's exactly what I expected. What if we said limit the first limit up to plane and selected this as the plane for the first limit and did a preview? Now we have the second limit here and the first limit here. Okay? And we'll say OK. Now let's take a look at the dialog box for a Pocket. Let's select the Pocket icon, select a sketch. Let's set more so we see the first and the second limit. Okay? Let's select the arrow to reverse the direction. Okay? And let's drag limit 1 out this way. Okay? Now let's make it not quite touch the part. Now remember, a Pocket removes material from the current part body. And the part body is everything that's been made before. Okay? And if I do a preview, you'll get a warning because there's nothing to remove. It hasn't intersected with the part yet. So we'll make it come through a little bit like this, and now we'll do a preview. So limit 1, we drag just like we do for pad, and then for limit 2, we can drag it also, and it's negative in the direction of limit 1 and positive in the direction of limit 2. Now, if we drag this all the way up to here and say preview, we'll see that it went all the way through the first surface. Let's drag limit 2 up to be about halfway, right about there, and now do a preview. Well, we'll see that we have kind of a pocket on this side. It doesn't come through this side. So this is behaving just like the pad dialog box. If we do a second limit as up to last, it's going out the limit 1 direction up to last. We can't do that. So let's go to dimension. Let's pick the first limit as up to last. And now do a preview. And that should have cut all the way through the part. Okay, let's cancel that. Okay. Now what I'd like to show also is that how up to next and up to last change if your profile doesn't intersect. So I'm going to select this pocket, sketch, and let's reverse direction, and let's say up to last, and say OK. Great. Now let's unhide the sketch. Let's double click the sketch, and let's move this sketch up till it's about here, and we'll say get out of Sketcher, and we'll update. Now that works fine. Now as soon as we went high enough that there was nothing to go through, this one would fail. Let's go to the pad dialog box. Let's go to its sketch, and its sketch is about here. Now let's drag its sketch up until it's like this, and exit Sketcher and update. And remember that this pad, let's unhide its sketch, this pad was made between these two planes. Let's go into its sketch again, and let's see what happens when we make it go higher than the box. Okay, let's make it come up here. Let's exit Sketcher and hit update. What it did is that actually extended the planes up so that it could still grab it for its limits. We would have expected it to maybe fail because there is no, we selected the face and there is no face up here, but it actually extended the plane. Now what would happen if we double click this? See, limit 2 is this plane. What if we change limit 2 to be up to surface and we pick this surface? Well, it can't extend the surface up to meet this, so it's giving you an error there. However, if I pick up to plane and I pick this, remember it's up to plane, so what it's doing, it's putting a plane on that face. And we'll say preview. There we go. And an update. Okay, let's take a look at the dialog boxes a little more. I've got some starter geometry here, 2 sketches that I've drawn. Sketch 1 and a sketch 2. This one's at a little bit of an angle. Let's select the pad definition. And now when I select this sketch, it's going to populate it right here in the profile or surface that it wants. Okay, so I select it. Now we'll talk about this option called mirrored extent. Okay. So right now we have a limit 1 and a limit 2, and they can be different. I'll make limit 2 dramatically bigger than limit 1. As soon as I select mirrored extent, limit 2 becomes whatever limit 1 is. As you drag limit 1, limit 2 changes also. And if we do a preview, the nice thing about this is a lot of times with your initial pad you'd like to, especially in the case of cylindrical parts, maybe like your axis system right down the middle. So that's the mirrored extent option. Okay. Now another one of the options here is you'll notice that the pad always extrudes perpendicular to the sketch, or what they call normal to the sketch plane. So now instead of being normal to the sketch plane, I'm going to turn that off. And now it's asking me to pick a direction, and the direction has to be a line or a straight edge of some kind. So I'll pick this, and now you'll notice if I do a preview, this is actually extruded now in the direction of that line element, and I'll preview it. There we go. Okay, so that's great, and I'll say OK. Now let's go to the pocket definition and see if it has some similar options. Okay, so I'm going to go to Sketcher first, and I'm going to sketch a profile here on the top, and I'll sketch a little, maybe a little rectangle right here. Okay, here we go. And I'd like this pocket. Here's my pocket dialog box, and by default it's coming straight down normal to the sketch plane. Okay? But it has the same option over here to turn off normal and to select a line element. And now that pocket, if I do a preview, that pocket is now coming down through the solid at the same angle. Now, pocket also has a limit 1 and a limit 2. And if you use the mirrored extent, well, sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense to use mirrored extent for the pocket option, but it certainly has some applications. So we see that the pad and the pocket dialog boxes share a lot of similarities, and we'll look at some of the other options here in just a little bit. And we'll continue with the similarities between some of the dialog boxes. Let's select the pad dialog icon and see its dialog box here. Here we go, and there's an option here that says thick. And if we select thick and we change the thickness now, let's change the thickness in here now that this is, see, if we turn thick off, this is dimmed out, it's not selectable. But when you turn it on, you can set a thickness, and let's set the thickness a little bit bigger, and let's do a preview. So now it's taken the open profile and added a thickness to it. A thickness 1, and if I increase thickness 2, you can see it's almost like limit 1 and limit 2. A thickness 1 is towards the inside, thickness 2 is towards the outside. And let's say OK. There we go. So that's for the pad. Now let's double click the pad and let's turn off the thick option, preview, and say OK. This is our pad. Let's see if it has something similar for the pocket. So we'll go to sketch and we'll sketch something here. Let's do a rectangle again. Okay. Get out of Sketcher and let's make our pocket. Our pocket dialog box comes up, and it also has a thick option. Let's set our first limit to be up to last, so it's going to go all the way through. This pocket is all the way through. As soon as we turn on the thick option, then we see that we have some thickness that we can add to the inside and some to the outside. And we do a preview. It's actually taking just the similar process for the pad. It's treating the profile. Instead of a closed profile, it's actually creating it as a wall for the thickness. Okay? And we can say, OK. Now, this would not be a good thing to do, is to leave your solid like this with multiple bodies, but you may be wanting to add even more features on top of this now. Okay? Now let's take a look at the pad dialog box again. Okay? So we've covered quite a bit now. We've covered the normal to profile. We've done the mirrored extent. We've done the thick options. And so that's most of the options here. There's more things that we can do. We have things, neutral fiber and things, but those are for more follow-on videos. As a recap here, looking at the dialog boxes for pad and pocket side by side really lets you see that they're just virtually identical here. We learned the concepts of limit 1 and limit 2 and the different options up to next, up to last, plane, and surface. We also learned what mirrored extent did and how it really just made limit 2 the same as limit 1. We learned the thick option, and then when you select thick, then you have two thin options for thickness 1 and thickness 2. And performs almost identically for pads and pockets. And then there's the normal to profile, that pads and pockets by default are extruded normal to their profile, but if you turn that off, you select a reference direction. Okay, that's great. Now we're going to go to some additional Sketchbased features called shafts and grooves. Now pads and pockets are extruded in a linear direction. Shafts and grooves go in a rotational direction. So we're going to look at whether these concepts that we've learned in the first dialog boxes, which of those apply to shafts and grooves. So let's take a look at that now. Okay, we have a little starter geometry here for shaft and groove. Two different sketches. They're both drawn on the same sketch support, but two different sketches. And I even drew a plane in here that's at an angle to any of our existing planes so that we can see if we can use it for this demonstration. So let's select the shaft, and let's select a sketch to use for this shaft. One of the things we notice right away is there is no limit 1 and limit 2 direction. It's called first angle, second angle. But over here we have these manipulators that are still called limit 1 and limit 2. So let's change limit 1 and let's change limit 2. Okay, and we'll say preview. Okay. So our sketch is here, and this is the orange arrow is the positive direction for measuring limit 1. And so limit 1 is a value of 306. Limit 2 is positive in this direction, the opposite of the orange arrow, so it has a positive value of 15 degrees. Now we have to be careful here though, because if we drag limit 2 all the way around here and bring it back to virtually the same position, it's now a negative 340. So you have to kind of remember how many times you've wrapped these things around, and if you do a preview, you get virtually the same part. So, you know, I would prefer that this be a small positive number rather than a value of negative 340. Okay? Now, you know, we did in pads and pockets, we had a normal to profile option where we could change the direction that it was extruded, but here we don't really have that because it has to go in a circle. But how did it know the axis to revolve around? Well, it just so happens that here it says that the sketch contains the axis. So if I actually go into the sketch, we will see that I've actually placed an axis in this sketch. I've actually placed an axis in the yellow sketch also, right down the origin there. Okay. Now, if I would like to, I've got another sketch in this model that is a line at a different angle. Okay, so I'm going to cancel this. Okay, let's unhide that sketch. Okay, this time instead of revolving the green around an axis that's vertical here, we'll revolve it around this axis. So I'll select the shaft icon. When I select here, it's got an axis internal, but we're going to override that. We're going to select here and select this one. And we'll say OK. And now we see we get a much different shape. Okay. Now if we double click it, we can change our limits by dragging them around. Okay, here we go. And we'll do a preview. Now what I'd like to take a look at is some of the other options. This thick profile operates just the same way it did for pad and pocket. You notice that we now have a limit of thickness 1 and a thickness 2 that go from the inside to the outside, and if we do a preview, we've just made a hollow part. Okay. And of course, there are some options here that we haven't learned yet, but this is the fundamentals of how we make a shaft. Now I am going to cancel this, and we'll delete that shaft. And now let's do a groove. Okay, let's hide this. Okay. Let's put the shaft back in, the default, all the way around. Let's make it come about here and say OK. Okay. Now we'll make a groove using this profile. Let's select the groove icon, select this, and we'll say OK. Now that removed material all the way around. If we double click it, and let's take a look more at its options. Well, it also has an option for thick profile. And if I do that, very similar to the pad and pocket, now it's actually almost used itself like a little wire to cut through there. Let's double click it and turn that thick off. And of course we could change the axis for it also. And it also has limit 1 and limit 2. And if we change these, we can actually make the groove go at different angles than the shaft. So now we can see that our groove comes through at different angles. So here we see the nearly identical shaft and groove dialog boxes. And we see how similar they are to the pad and the pocket. You know, the limits have changed now. Instead of limit 1 and limit 2 with some options, we have a first angle and second angle. Mirrored extent is still there and operates the same way. Thick is still there and operates the same way. Instead of normal to profile, we have something where we select an axis, which is our revolute axis. It kind of makes sense. Now, there's also something called neutral fiber and merge ends that's in both of these dialog boxes and was also in the pad and pocket dialog box. The thing I want to point out here is that even though we haven't learned what those are yet, since they're in all these dialog boxes, once we learn it for one of these dialog boxes, we really don't need to relearn it for all the others. So there's a lot of commonality in all of these dialog boxes.